False friendships do not collapse randomly. They reveal themselves at precise psychological pressure points where masks become too heavy to maintain. What appears as loyalty often functions as situational convenience, held together by benefit rather than truth. Many people misread consistency as trust, while ignoring subtle fractures in behavior that were always there. The discomfort begins when social circles feel strangely performative, as if emotional safety depends on constant adaptation. Conversations feel slightly staged, support feels conditional, and silence often carries more truth than words ever do. Ancient psychological frameworks, later expanded by Carl Jung and modern behavioral psychology, suggest that human relationships are structured by hidden emotional contracts that rarely get spoken aloud. These contracts determine who stays, who distances, and who subtly observes without revealing intention. In the next few moments, the invisible mechanics behind fake friendships will become readable like a psychological map, exposing patterns that were always operating beneath surface interactions, changing how trust itself is perceived. Friendship is often perceived as a stable emotional bond, yet in behavioral psychology it is closer to a dynamic system of exchange, perception, and internal projection. People rarely connect to others directly. Instead, they interact through expectations, emotional needs, and unconscious assessments of value. Modern social psychology suggests that relationships are continuously evaluated through microsignals, tone shifts, response timing, emotional availability, and subtle changes in attention. These signals form an invisible language that most people feel but rarely consciously decode. The illusion of fake friends begins when emotional reciprocity becomes uneven but remains socially disguised. One side may invest authenticity while the other operates through selective engagement. This imbalance is not always intentional. It can emerge from insecurity, ego preservation, or emotional limitation. Jung's reinterpretation of relational psychology highlights a deeper layer. Individuals do not always see others as they are, but as emotional extensions of their own internal state. This means trust is often built on projection rather than observation. As relationships evolve, hidden tensions accumulate beneath everyday interactions. Small inconsistencies, missed support moments, delayed empathy, shifting enthusiasm, begin forming a pattern. The mind, however, tends to normalize these signals to preserve emotional stability. This creates a cognitive conflict. The emotional desire for belonging overrides the analytical detection of imbalance. Over time, the relationship may continue functioning socially while internally losing coherence. What appears as friendship may slowly transform into a performance of connection, where both sides sense something unspoken but avoid naming it directly. But this is only the surface of the shift. The most misleading aspect of fake friendships is that they often feel emotionally real at the beginning. Psychological research into social bonding suggests that early trust is frequently built on similarity bias rather than actual relational depth. This means the mind confuses shared interests, humor, or timing with long-term emotional alignment. The paradox is that the strongest initial connections can sometimes produce the weakest long-term stability. As time progresses, subtle behavioral inconsistencies begin to emerge, yet they do not immediately break the connection. Instead, they create ambiguity, moments where loyalty feels present but not fully reliable. Social cognition studies show that the brain tends to fill relational gaps with optimistic interpretation, especially when emotional investment is already established. This creates a distortion field where warning signs are visible but reinterpreted as temporary fluctuations. In some cases, individuals may maintain proximity not because of genuine connection, but because of convenience, identity reinforcement, or fear of social loss. The unsettling part is that fake friendship does not always involve betrayal. Sometimes it involves gradual emotional withdrawal that remains socially invisible. And what becomes most confusing is that the signs are often there from the beginning, yet they only become readable after emotional distance creates clarity. What remains hidden beneath this pattern is even more complex than the behavior itself. Human perception of relationships is largely governed by subconscious processing systems that operate beneath conscious awareness. These systems continuously scan for emotional safety, social ranking, and behavioral consistency, forming rapid judgments before rational thought engages. From a psychological perspective, the subconscious acts less like a passive storage unit and more like an active prediction engine. It builds expectations about people based on past emotional experiences, cultural conditioning, and internal emotional needs. This means that what is perceived as friendship is partially constructed in the mind before it is validated by reality. Perception does not simply observe relationships, it actively constructs them. When individuals expect trust, they interpret ambiguous behavior positively. When they expect betrayal, the same behavior may appear suspicious. This dynamic creates a feedback loop where internal belief systems influence interpretation, which then reinforces the belief system itself. Behavioral psychology describes this as a recursive interpretive loop, where perception and expectation continuously reshape each other. Within this loop, fake friendships are not always obvious because the mind actively filters information to maintain emotional equilibrium. Even contradictory signals may be softened or ignored if the relationship holds psychological value. Social behavior is also shaped by learned interaction patterns formed during early development. Individuals unconsciously replicate relational templates that define how trust, distance, and emotional exchange are expressed. Some people develop overgiving patterns, associating value with emotional availability. Others develop selective engagement patterns, where closeness is regulated based on internal comfort rather than relational responsibility. These patterns can coexist within the same friendship, creating structural imbalance without explicit conflict. The relationship continues functioning externally while internally operating on mismatched emotional algorithms. Within Jungian psychological frameworks, particularly reinterpretations influenced by Carl Jung's symbolic model of the psyche, relationships can be seen as mirrors reflecting internal emotional architecture rather than fixed external truths. From this perspective, fake friendships are not merely external betrayals, but also reflections of unconscious alignment between individuals at a specific psychological frequency. This does not imply mystical causation, but rather suggests that perception, expectation, and emotional resonance shape relational outcomes in deeply interdependent ways. The revelation of fake friends often occurs not when they change, but when internal awareness becomes more precise than emotional projection. At that point, previously invisible patterns become structurally visible. Yet even this insight does not fully resolve the mystery of why certain connections persist despite clear imbalance. In many social environments, connection appears abundant yet emotionally inconsistent. Conversations may remain frequent, but depth gradually diminishes. Emotional support becomes irregular, and attention shifts depending on convenience rather than presence. There are situations where engagement feels slightly delayed, responses lack emotional alignment, or interest fluctuates without clear reason. These patterns do not immediately signal conflict, yet they create subtle internal tension that is difficult to define. Over time, relational dynamics may begin to feel asymmetrical. One side invests emotional consistency, while the other operates with selective involvement. This imbalance often remains unspoken, creating internal uncertainty rather than external confrontation. A deeper recognition emerges when emotional fatigue is no longer tied to specific events, but to the pattern of interaction itself. The mind begins registering that certain connections require continuous emotional adjustment to maintain stability. In such cases, silence carries meaning that words do not resolve. Support may feel conditional, and presence may feel intermittent in ways that are difficult to articulate. Psychological systems interpret these experiences as unresolved relational signals, where trust is neither fully broken nor fully secure. This creates a state of ongoing cognitive processing, where the relationship remains active in awareness even when nothing explicit is happening. What becomes clear is not always who is fake, but how emotional alignment behaves under inconsistency. And that realization quietly changes how connection itself is understood. Awareness of relational dynamics does not emerge as a sudden conclusion, but as a gradual refinement of perception. Patterns that once blended into social background noise begin to separate into distinguishable signals. Attention slowly shifts toward how consistency, emotional response, and presence interact over time, rather than in isolated moments. This shift does not require judgment, but observation of how internal reactions respond to external behavior. Psychological systems often adjust interpretation based on emotional attachment, which means clarity develops when emotional intensity stabilizes enough to allow neutral perception. In this state, relationships are no longer evaluated only by words or isolated actions, but by continuity of behavior across different contexts. What becomes noticeable is the structure beneath interaction, the rhythm of engagement, withdrawal, and return. This awareness does not demand immediate conclusions. It simply reveals that perception is always active, continuously shaping meaning from subtle relational data that was present all along. And within that recognition, the nature of connection begins to appear more layered than previously assumed. Some connections do not end, they clarify. What once felt confusing becomes structured when seen without emotional distortion. Friendship is revealed less as certainty and more as shifting alignment between inner worlds. The mind does not discover fake friends in a single moment. It gradually learns to read continuity where illusion once filled the gaps. Meaning forms not from words alone, but from patterns that repeat across silence, presence, and distance. In that quiet recognition, relationships stop being mysteries and start becoming maps of perception itself. And sometimes understanding others is only another way of seeing the architecture of awareness more clearly. Not all presence is connection, and not all distance is absence.